All right. There we go. Thank you for waiting while I got a couple things set up on the presentation browser. And by the way, Nerdy Sakura, it's good that you're communicating with your DM about special requests like that. I mean, what the worst case is your DM says no, in which case you continue on and, things will be as they are. But I do sincerely hope that you have fun with this other campaign that you're getting involved in. And for a lot of conversation, even kind of like what you're talking about, Nerdy Sakura, or what some of you out there have brought up here and there about fantasy worlds, or about running games, or optional rules, or even just other themes. That's exactly why I wanted to present In My World with you all. Now, In My World is going to help us ask questions of ourselves as world builders or as DMs, GMs, and STs about what goes into your unique presentation, whether it's your twist on a written module, like what Nerdy Sakura is going to go through with Out of the Abyss, or a homebrew world that you've been working on. What sets it apart? How is it different from any other, totally not Western Europe or not feudal Japan, or how is it not generic D&D world, whatever vanilla, straight out of the player's handbook, which has its own, I guess by this point it is a sort of generic fantasy world consideration. How can you tweak things to have a responsive, thriving world where not everything in the book may exist or extra things do? And have it come across as not overly complicated or still as a holistic presentation. And before we get to specifics of, well, in my world, there's currently an alcohol prohibition, because we will get to things like that. How does that impact a society? How does that impact religion, or sociology, or economics, agriculture, all these, we can run these experiments where something does or doesn't exist that is mundane and identifiable to our real world, to use that as inspiration. Though I'm not looking to drag the real world kicking and screaming into a fantasy world. We play these games for escapism. We play these games to get away from the real stuff. So anything that I bring up in the course of conversations are not meant to drive home a real point, simply a consideration to hold, look at, and either take with you or set down and find another during your journey. Welcome back, Hunter. But before we get to the minutia of, should water flow uphill, should I cap my game at level 10? Or, again, how does alcohol prohibition affect a fantasy world where it exists? Let's talk about more fundamental things. Which type of game... Hi, Fragstorm. Which type of game would you like to run? Because the flavor is going to be a lot different. Yes, you may allow Fireball to exist as a spell in any of these, though the requirements might change, the manifestations might change, the frequency might change, depending on the type of fantasy you wish to talk about, or to present, to foster and grow, to plant that seed of story and watch it be nurtured by the players. Now, for this, we're going to be referencing Masterclass here, a complete overview of fantasy subgenres. The broad tent of fantasy literature has spawned many fantasy subgenres that range from mythical and gritty to modern and otherworldly. And by the way, we'll be exploring modern fantasy this summer when I'm asking 4 of you out there to play Everyday Heroes with me. That is modern 5th edition. Okay? Understanding the different fantasy subgenres can help aspiring writers find their niche so that they can create a fantasy series that readers can enjoy for years to come. Now, this is coming from a literary, writing background. There's a lot of overlap, but remember, writing a book and running a D&D game do have differences. You can't expect your players to do everything that you need them to do, like an author can just command the characters in a book to do. GMV says, I only play every other day heroes. Well, I guess that rules you out of playing with me this summer. Maybe one day we can roll some dice together, GMV. But hey, for those of you out there on our Discord, that's where I will be soliciting for players in June to play a 3-session original story presented in Everyday Heroes. Fantasy novels take on many forms, and the number of distinct fantasy subgenres seems to grow with each passing year. Here are 18 particularly important subgenres within the world of fantasy. Now, you do not need to memorize all these. In fact, you may not even be able to categorize the type of fantasy that you are running or even just want to run, let alone what develops. Don't worry about categorizing. Don't worry about slapping labels onto things. It will happen. It's a part of the process. If you're writing to fit into a container, you are limiting yourself. Just like I urge you as an individual human being to not label yourself. You are not an adjective. You are a noun. You are a proper noun at that, okay? Don't treat your story, your game table, the same way. Don't treat it as an adjective. Dystopian fantasy. Sometimes grouped with science fiction, speculative fiction, and literary fiction, dystopian fantasies imagine worlds gone wrong. The settings are at once familiar to contemporary audiences and also alarmingly worse than the present world. Jack Vance's Dying Earth series is a pulpy example of this subgenre of fantasy fiction. High fantasy, sometimes called epic fantasy. High fantasy is set in a magical environment that has its own rules and physical laws. This subgenre's plots and themes have a grand scale and typically center on a single well-developed hero or a band of heroes, such as Frodo Baggins and his cohorts in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, or Bilbo Baggins and the Dwarves in The Hobbit. George R.R. Martin combines high fantasy with elements of medieval fantasy and romance in his Song of Ice and Fire series, and the Game of Thrones television series based on the books. Hopefully, if you hear Dying Earth, you hear The Hobbit, you're getting good examples of what this, the majority of the bell curve of what these genres will incorporate. Low fantasy. Set in the real world, low fantasy includes unexpected magical elements that surprise ordinary characters, like the plastic figurines come to life in Lynn Reed Banks's The Indian in the Cupboard. It's been a while since I've read that book. For any of you out there who have, I hope you've enjoyed it. But this is a good example of low fantasy, and maybe others come to mind as well. Magical realism. While similar to low fantasy, magical realism characters accept fantastical elements like levitation and telekinesis as a normal part of their otherwise realistic world, as in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's magical realism classic 100 Years of Solitude. This is one with which I'm not familiar, though another example would be the movie that has that Will Smith is in it. I think it's called Bright, which is a modern fantasy world where, I mean, if you're an elf, okay, you're an elf. Orcs exist, or it's just another. It's just another part of a normal. It's fantasy to us. It's completely normal. It'd be like running Shadowrun with cyberpunk goblins, kind of a thing, right? Sword and sorcery. A subset of high fantasy, this subgenre focuses on sword-wielding heroes, such as the titular barbarian in Robert E. Howard's Conan Pulp Fiction series, as well as magic or witchcraft. J.K. Rowling popularized the sword and sorcery subgenre for young adults with her Harry Potter series. Urban fantasy, in which fantastical characters and concepts are placed in... actually, maybe Bright is better for urban fantasy. In a real-world urban setting, often in the present day. Urban fantasy novels have devoted followings, and they have spawned film and TV adaptations. Urban fantasy stories often draw from noir and gritty police procedurals. They also may incorporate fantastical elements and supernatural creatures. These could involve undead zombies, vampires, druids, demons, wizardry, witchcraft, and other such fantasy tropes. The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher and American Gods by Neil Gaiman are examples of urban fantasy. Paranormal romance. This fantasy subgenre combines romantic themes with fantasy elements like vampires, werewolves, shifters, fairies, and zombie armies. Many contemporary fantasy series blur the line between urban fantasy stories, coming-of-age tales, and paranormal romances. Patricia Briggs and Janine Frost are popular authors in this subgenre. Dark fantasy. Combining elements of fantasy with the horror genre, dark fantasy's aim is to unnerve and frighten readers. For example, consider the gargantuan otherworldly monsters in H.P. Lovecraft's universe. Gothic and Victorian dark fantasy tends to embrace a paranormal setting and supernatural elements, which can range from vampires to werewolves and beyond. Note that by no means is every paranormal fantasy a dark fantasy. Grimdark fantasy. One step beyond dark fantasy, grimdark novels pry into the blackest depths of the human condition, often in the proverbial underbelly of an alternate world. The Court of Broken Knives by Anna Smith Spark is a popular book within this subgenre. I can't say I've heard of this book. I think many people think of grimdark as well when we come around to like Warhammer, especially Warhammer 40,000 in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. There is only war. It is not just dystopia, but it does combine dark fantasy. It is like a dark dystopian mix. Fables. Using personified animals and supernatural and the supernatural, fables impart moral lessons, like the stories in Aesop's fables and Arabian Nights. Pretty straightforward. You want to convey an idea. Pardon. It doesn't have to be... It can be thinly veiled if you want to try and make a point. Hopefully it's not ham-fisted. Not that a story must be completely devoid of touching on the three taboo topics of sex, religion, or politics, because these are things that touch our lives in different ways. There's certainly ways to write, or especially to present topics that might be parallel without seeming like a ham-fisted attempt to make a point. Are you trying to tell a story, or are you just trying to, own a group of people online that you disagree with? hopefully the default, even if it's close, 51-49, is to tell a story that might happen to have parallels for or against something else in your life. Abe's here. Well, thank you for joining us, Abe. Kragar says the Dungeon Dude setting of Drakkenheim as well is grimdark. And Kragar also said before that had an interesting concept but didn't have enough depth given to it, and the film went too fast. Yeah. Bright, I think Bright could have been more.
It's about a guy who found a guy on the interwebs and then just never went home. The end.
The end. Bane, thank you for perpetually being here and hopefully not spiraling too quickly into madness and blasphemy. All right, lurk mode, Kragar. But welcome, Bane. Thank you for joining us here. You know what? I think this is like we reviewed. You know, we've done reviews. We've done mini painting in the office setting here. I think this is my first workshop now being here, so I'm really happy to be able to present this stuff to you all. Fairy tales. Intended for children, fairy tales and folk tales are typically set in distant magical worlds, where trolls, dragons, witches, and other supernatural characters are an accepted truth, as in the Brothers Grimm's fairy tales. Superhero fantasy. Unlike stories in which a hero acquires special abilities through scientific means, such as exposure to radiation, the protagonist's powers are more fantastical superhero story. More fantastical superhero stories are supernatural. Many superhero stories are set in a low fantasy world, one that's quite similar to our own world. Superheroes ranging from Wonder Woman to Thor bring fantasy elements to worlds that otherwise obey the known laws of science. You know, they are the exceptions to the accepted rules that we as the reader can agree to with, you know, John Q. Public in the comic. Many superhero fantasy authors have worked in the comic book medium, from Stan Lee to Bob Kane. As such, superhero fiction in the fantasy genre is also known as comic fantasy or comic book fantasy. Fantasy of manners. This subgenre, exemplified by fantasy books like Gormenghast by Mervyn Peake, combines supernatural world building with the type of society-centric concerns one might encounter in a work by Edith Wharton or Noel Coward. Human drama and pettiness may outweigh magical powers in this subgenre of fantasy literature. Cross-worlds fantasy. Sometimes called portal fantasy, this subgenre involves characters transporting from a normal world to a magical one. This requires authors to engage in both magical world building and grounded realistic world building. Cross-worlds fantasy stories often appeal to children, as seen in the Chronicles of Narnia series by C.S. Lewis and Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. These works also fit a category known as juvenile fantasy. Now, I will say, since then, perhaps it's matured some, because you have the Outlander series. That is not, that's for mature readers. Or, if you happen to be an unrepentant weeaboo, an otaku who enjoys the animus and the mangers, then you're very familiar with isekai. As that would also be cross-worlds fantasy. Now, in the case of Outlander, that's more low fantasy. I mean, there's the gateway that leads the character through the circumstances. Whereas isekai tends to be more of a high fantasy. You go from, normal everyday modern Japan, truck-kun, pays a visit to you and delivers you to some high fantasy world where adventure awaits. Abraham says, or Abe says, have you ever created a scientist miniature yet? If not, how would you go about doing it? Creating the miniature as in 3D sculpting one, Abe? Bane says, that happened to me. I was born again in a mundane world with a superpower. Unfortunately, they keep telling me that power is useless and I should stop daydreaming. I have not self-programmed 3D sculpting yet, Abe. So I can't give you any insight into the creation of a 3D model. I can look at a model and I can tell you what works and what doesn't from a viewer point of view, or someone who might print it or paint it or play a character around it. You know, I can sit back and answer the question, but is it art? I can do that. I cannot give you technical knowledge on how to sculpt one, other than I have preferences for how miniatures are sculpted, such that they should look dynamic. They should look like they are a part of a world in which they belong, which could be any of these genres that we're talking about. But yeah, I can't tell you, oh yeah, the keyboard shortcut to make an indentation, you know, for every millimeter you need to like hold shift, and if you need 2 millimeters you hold shift 2 and then click or whatever. I don't know that much about modeling software. I can help you with supports in Chitu Box. I can help you with things about manipulating an already made 3D model or printing one. But the creation of one, it's beyond me currently. I haven't plugged into the Matrix yet to know how to fly that helicopter. Bane says it's actually very easy. Step 1, Hero Forge. Step 2, download. Step 3, print. Step 4, profit for Hero Forge. It can be that easy as well. Hero Forge has made it very user-friendly to create your own 3D mini. So, you know, I'm definitely not sponsored by them. That would be cool if I was. I think Hero Forge sponsors people. But I am not sponsored by them, but they do make it pretty easy to come up with a character. Then we get into steampunk, and this could go, this might just be punk fantasy, because even beyond steampunk, you have diesel punk, you have hex punk. There are many other punks that are a flavor of this. Arthurian fantasy. These historical fantasy stories exist in a magical world of King Arthur, although Arthur himself is not always the main character. Due to their magical setting, Arthurian fantasy novels and short stories tend to feature mythic creatures like dragons, and many of their heroes are knights, which makes them part of a heroic fantasy's subgenre. I might also say Arthurian fantasy might qualify as low fantasy. It's there. Well, I mean, yeah, there is low fantasy here. In this case, maybe with this definition, low fantasy is saying unexpected magical elements, whereas people in an Arthurian would accept a dragon existing. Or I guess you could say historical fantasy, where you're telling a tale in a period of time where everything is normal except a couple things that are not. And it might be low fantasy where a dragon can exist, but you have to deal with it in mundane historical ways. Being more clever or something along those lines. There are some games like there's Dark Ages Cthulhu, or even Vampire the Masquerade Dark Ages, that can delve into something similar. How do you hunt powerful vampires as a peasant living in a Western or Eastern European country? You know, especially compared with how do we deal with them in the modern world with mobile phone cameras and high-powered rifles and other stuff like that. Sci-fi fantasy. These stories can be set in any variety of time periods, which means they can be contemporary, modern, or futuristic, or even historical. No, there's historical fantasy. But they establish a new world where scientific advancements have changed the rules of engagement while still incorporating magical elements. The Star Wars series and the various works of Isaac Asimov have helped set the bar. And this is important because Star Wars is arguably more fantasy than sci-fi. There are undeniably sci-fi elements. I would say it's more fantasy than it is a pure science fiction story. And then wuxia fantasy. This subgenre is rooted in classic Chinese literature. It involves elements of fantasy inspired by martial arts. Jade City by Fonda Lee is an example of wuxia fantasy. And that could get into, Rokugan and the Legend of the Five Rings, something along those lines in that setting or that part of the world. While fantasy can be a lot of different things in a lot of different time periods, and this might speak as someone who lives in the Western Hemisphere or is approaching this from an occidentally centric presentation. There tends to be that generic Western European fantasy setting where for many people the concept of fantasy makes you think of ye olde England kind of a thing, whereas then there are the Oriental adventures. That was a rule book from a time long ago, shrouded in mists of the past, where the Oriental adventures. But you get locales like feudal Japan, you get Korean Peninsula, you get Chinese Empire, Jade Empire kind of a thing. Fantasy Orient. And depending on how you're tying it to our real world, and obviously there could be dangers set in tying something to real world. Does that go down to the Arabian Peninsula? How is that handled? Seventh Sea does an interesting job of presenting various regions in a fantasy world that has echoes of our real globe in Seventh Sea, but do have their own distinct things. And Dragon Blast, hello. I'm sorry. So as I was talking, Abe was also speaking. In my campaign, the one that I run is set in a Washington State version of Xanth. Oh, okay. Now, of course, we all know that Xanth is totally not Florida. Wink. What do I think about your campaign concept? What genre would it fall under? You haven't really mentioned that much, Abe. I don't have a lot of information to go on. If you're talking about Washington State, so it's a region that receives a lot of rain, has a large mountain, is getting into high plains in the east, and is getting into coastal weather with large trees on the west. That could be any of these genres. If you want to try something interesting, Shadowrun is set in Seattle. You can get the Seattle player's guide for Shadowrun if you want to see an interesting cyberpunk fantasy mashup set in a fantasy Seattle, Washington. But otherwise, Abe, if everyone has fireballs and swords as per D&D, then whether or not it's based on some geography in Washington State, it's probably just a high fantasy that you're running. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying that dismissively, like, it's just another high fantasy, because every fantasy run is the possibility for a new and wonderful and amazing story. Things to discover, new ways to approach old ideas. So there is vim and vigor involved. But just saying that you have something like a Washington, a Washington State style game, but that's otherwise D&D, you might need to talk a little bit more about the concepts in it. Then we can discuss which kind of fantasy. Now, I brought these up. Again, you don't have to memorize it, and please don't feel like you have to categorize your game. Well, my game is totally a dark fantasy, but it also has elements of Crossworld, and there is a city of steampunks, and then because you can find a couple things from everything in anything. Don't feel like you need to put your world or your story into a box. You are writing a living, breathing story with players at your table. Treat it like a human being. Human beings are not adjectives. And your story is not a mere adjective either. But these are places to start, a simple concept from which to grow. And this is something to ask yourself. What do I want to present? Because, if Abe wants to present a world where there are puns of real world stuff to us, but have a fantasy blend to them, then there's a direction. And this is exactly where In My World is going to be picking up. We need to choose a direction. What is a theme that we wish to present more often than not? You can have a fable that's trying to tell a moral tale, still have a dark element to it. Especially fairy tales may very well have those dark elements too. Even though it is a fairy story of magic and wonder. Hey, that's cool that you're co-DMing with your sibling there, Abe. That will help you both continue to grow as storytellers. And it's great to bounce ideas back and forth off of someone who does think differently than you do. Because between the two of you, you might find something that neither of you had considered before, or you refine. She presents something, you say, I like it, but let's approach it this other way. And between the two of you, you have something really solid. Now, we're not committing in this workshop to a type of fantasy yet, okay? Not yet. We'll get there. Something else to think over is the system of magic that you would like to use. Now, no low fantasy or no fantasy. You can still have a fantasy world that is no magic, because people can still do incredible things, through themselves, or the concept of willpower, or gods may work in mysterious ways, even though there's no one who's throwing fireballs. So you can have a low or no a fantasy setting with low or no magic. Not everything has to be high magic. Now, if it is no magic, well, that's a lot closer to our world that we can conceptualize. So I'm not going to worry about that as an option or something to discuss, as that is more cleverness wins the day. It's up to people to solve their own problems and not the Deus Ex Machina of giant eagles or only one person in the world knows how to solve this and does it through magic that doesn't have to get explained, that kind of a thing. What do you mean by silly magic, Abe? But let's now consider systems of magic. This is not an exhaustive list, and again, you do not have to classify your magic in a particular way. These are starting points. However, magic is going to have a tremendous influence on the cultures of your fantasy world. Whether it is no magic, low magic, or whether something like necromancy is seen as taboo and punishable by death, even if you didn't perform it. We get into witch hunts. Or necromancy is actually common and is an ingrained part of society, and in fact is an expectation for you. I had a lot of fun with a society where that was the case in my world. But let's cross that bridge in just a second. For Ravenloft, as for silly magic, I mean spells that usually, by the way of the name, make the DM laugh. Well, it's fine to laugh and have fun. Sometimes that everything is meant to be high spirits, or you need a little bit of humor in a setting like Ravenloft, because you have to breathe every once in a while before you can be scared again. But if everything is silly all of the time, then that can defeat the point of horror or dystopia or other things. Or why I'm getting a little ahead of myself. It's not silly haha, silly in concept in a way that you can have a spell that brings someone back to life, like a resurrection spell in Dungeons and Dragons. Whereas silly stuff can defeat the point of a type of storytelling, a spell in your world, like True Resurrection, can completely destroy the sanctity of life or the way that life is perceived by a culture or society. It can cheapen what life actually is or means. Just like having an extra dimensional space, like a bag of holding, can cheapen the experience of finding treasure or hauling things around. And something as simple as the existence of a bag of holding can dramatically change society, depending on the type of story you're telling in your setting. Yeah, and so Abe, if horror is not your thing, I mean, you might have something, you might spice a story with a little bit of spookiness now and again, but you tend to stay away from it. And that's fine. Those are the stories that you like presenting or that you like playing. And there's a type of fantasy for everyone, because fantasies are born from individual people. Now, what are 9 different types of magic? Some things to consider. If you're interested in writing fantasy or science fiction to a lesser extent, you've likely considered building a magic system. Truly, magic is one of the few consistencies across nearly all works within the genre. It's such a ubiquitous element, in fact, that many writers, myself included, start their journey into fantasy by devising a magic system. This is why we're talking about it on this fundamental planning stage. Now, if you're playing D&D, and you just accept, well, the player's handbook is going to be the basis of magic for my world, then there you go. The work has been done for you. You've picked it up. Maybe you include or disclude a spell here or there. I disclude spells from the base player's handbook, let alone the official expansions from it. But this is something that is fundamental to your world, to your fantasy world. We're leaving no magic off the table because no magic is no magic. Though, what kind of magic would you like? There's nature-based magic, water, earth, fire, air, everything between. Divination magic, see beyond sight and peer through time and space. Conjuring magic, move objects through space over any distance. Psychic magic, master the world of the mind. Life and death magic, tap into the very forces of life, death, and undeath. Animal or creature exclusive magic, some creatures just do it better. Magitech systems, blurring the lines of sorcery and science. Eclectic magic, it doesn't have to be real magic to have a real effect. Or some uncommon magic system, the unsung heroes of fantasy magic. The type differs with a measure of a magic system's hardness, which indicates how thoroughly defined it's in. We're going to get into that next. Some of you might already be jumping the gun going, oh, hard magic or soft magic? We'll get there, I promise. Just trust me, bro, okay? And whether the world is high or low magic. This is something we also brought up. Identifying the prevalence and frequency of magic in the setting. We've put together this list of 9 types of magic systems found within fantasy and science fiction. This is not an exhaustive list, however, as there are many types of magic in fantasy fiction. Bear in mind that these are literary definitions, not scientific ones. The categories included and the magic systems arranged within them are subject to shift as the landscape of fantasy fiction continues to evolve. So, different types of nature-based magic. I'm not going to read them all. You can do so from the link I provided. Elemental magic. Avatar: The Last Airbender is a very good example. Floromancy or mycomancy. Poison ivy from Batman is capable of all botanical manipulations. Classically, alchemy is the transmutation of one compound into another, turning lead to gold. So these are elements as well, just not the Western, or even if you go Eastern and you include other concepts like metal, wood, void, some other things like that. Weather magic as well can fall into this. Divination magic. Typically, divination requires a medium like tarot cards, flocks of birds, knuckle bones, clear pool of water, copious amounts of corpses, where even some truly bizarre forms of divination like alphitomancy, which was used to determine a guilty party by how they digested a piece of blessed bread or cake. While these are interesting systems in their own right, they're essentially the magical equivalent of entering a construction site with only a hammer in your tool belt. You can, all you can do is hit things. And so you can put this into other systems. Of course, this is a school of magic within Dungeons and Dragons, if that's what you're sticking to. Though that is used as a descriptor for, communication magic. Conjuration is a type of magic. In this case, this would be Mage Hand, Find Familiar, so that's getting into a D&D definition. Summoning magic, something that brings something into being. You're conjuring fire, you're conjuring a devil, you're building up something. They mentioned the Dishonored games as well. Psychic magic. By the way, the mage system in the World of Darkness has interesting schools of magic as well, and those are well worth looking into if you wanted to try and mix up your concepts of how you perceive magic. Psychic magic is just that can get into telepathy, that can get into psionics, That can get into various forms of clairvoyance. Enchanters, at least in so much of emotional manipulation, you are an enchanting person. Not necessarily, I enchant this this empty bottle with the ability to turn frosty cold on a command word. Life and death magic, which does have its own kind of blood magic as well. That references Dragon Age. I had a lot of fun with a blood magic system in my world. There's a lot here, and this gets, especially because of life and death and how it is valued in the world overall, in a particular culture in your world. You can have a lot of fun with this, and you can do a ton of world building by this existing or not existing itself. Or if you limit it, only one person in the world can bring someone back to life. We're going to go and see Miracle Max. And all of a sudden, Miracle Max, by being the only person who can do this, Miracle Max never came across as some imposing figure or someone who can hold entire kingdoms, in sway, in the palm of his hand. And yet, he could, if he really wanted to. All right. Hey, Abe, thank you for hanging out. Thank you for being a part of the stream and conversation tonight. Animal or creature exclusive magic. And so that could be something where maybe no one in your world has magic, but dragons might have magic, or supernatural style abilities like breathing fire if it's not biological. So the people may not be able to do magical things, but there could be magical creatures around the people. And you find this in, mythology. It's talking about sirens, that kind of a thing. Magitech systems. This is, it's magic and technology. Of course, the line can blur. One person's magic is another person's technology. A very good film that delves into that is called The Gods Must Be Crazy. If you're not familiar with that movie, I highly suggest you watch it. It's a lot of fun, and it's an interesting perspective on things. But is there really? Why isn't this psychic magic? Or why isn't this conjuration? I can conjure things. I can talk to people over vast differences. In fact, I can use more than 25 words because I have unlimited nights and weekends. I might have a little bit more than unlimited nights and weekends, but I hope that you understand. Do you get the concept? Do you get the idea? Is that a dated reference? And some of you out there, there's 19 of you. Are some of you going, unlimited nights and weekends? What is that? And why is this dude holding a phone up and saying unlimited nights and weekends? Is that an app? If you want to consider things like cyberpunk as a form of magitech, because the science is doing incredible things, like it's explainable, and it's still a bit of a black box where we just say it's science, but we understand it's science. We don't need to know how the gears are meshed in order to know that you have a super-powered shoulder that can help you lift stuff. We just go, oh, you have this upgrade, and okay, it's now acceptable, and we don't see it as magic, even though it might as well be. Eclectic magic. Difficult to pin down, eclectic magic derives from a broad range of sources and doesn't always have a direct or tangible effect on the world. We're talking about everything from folk magic to parlor tricks. These may only hold power in the minds of their practitioners or the eyes of their witnesses, but since magic is the art of producing an effect from nothing, it is the beings that believe these magics to be real that can have an effect on the world as a result. Folk traditions have long held a wide variety of magical practices across all cultures throughout the world. European practitioners of this type of magic are generally called cunning folk, though dozens of variations were used in different languages. More often than not, folk magic dealt in the healing of harms, lifting of curses, and warding off evil spirits. It's worth noting here that folk magic is a modern concept and that those living at the time simply saw this as medicine, whether physical or spiritual. You might also see cunning folk handing out charms and talismans, crafting potions and poultices, the famous love potion, and warning against the dangers of the fair folk and their fairy circles. Conversely, illusionists use sleight of hand to astound audiences. While in fiction, this can be used to mask true magic, as is the case of Christopher Priest's The Prestige, and the Knights. I would watch The Prestige. If you have not, I think that's the name of the movie anyway. It could be based on a book. If you haven't seen this, I would highly recommend watching this movie. It is itself a magic system in its own right. It maintains a magical effect, the audience is astounded, and rules and limitations. The spell is broken if the audience discovers the mechanics behind the illusion. So think of this like kind of like Scooby-Doo stuff. Stage magic and parlor tricks may simply be used for entertainment, but in a literary sense, that doesn't make it any less magical, nor does it always have to be mere amusement. Uncommon systems, and this was the unsung heroes of fantasy magic. So let's read through this one as well. All the types of magic systems detailed above have been categorized by theme and or mechanic. However, they are also arranged this way because they have the benefit of more frequent appearances in science fiction and fantasy literature. We group this fantasy category of magic systems together because we believe they haven't been given frequent opportunities to shine, though all could be categorized into any of the above types. Let's review a handful of uncommon magic systems. Sound and color magic, time magic, egoic magic, beast speech, manufactured magic, glass baubles and stuff, nothingness magic, this could also just be the one person in the world who's magical, and otherwise a system that doesn't have a lot of it. Or who's the one powerful magic user in a world where everyone can, everyone has cantrips. However, there is out there a fabled creature called a wizard, a 5th level wizard, that has the ultimate war-ending spell, Fireball. The most ultimate and world-shattering magic. Why wouldn't Fireball not be the, be an equivalent in a magical world if there's only really a source of one of them to some grand design weapon used in war? Especially if everyone else in the world might have one cantrip. We have a very magical society. It's broad magic. It's very shallow magic. And in the world where everyone has a cantrip, the 5th level wizard that can cast Fireball is king. That's a little bit ahead of also where we're going with the ideas, but I don't mind showing a little bit of ankle. Hunter says, how about the live GTA 5 server known as La Crosse, Wisconsin, home of the most fatherless homes in... What? What did I miss? Dragon Blast says the psychic, chronomancy, pain of understanding. I must have missed something up in chat. I have no idea what you're talking about, La Crosse, Wisconsin. Goblin of Gygaxanor says cast split atoms. Yeah. Oh, all right, Hunter. All right. Thank you for something, because I'm like, what conversation was going on while I was talking about fantasy worlds? Gotcha. All right. Now, the final part to discuss in this initial primer of our workshop is here. It was made mention hard magic and soft magic. If you're not familiar with Brandon Sanderson, he's some literal who. You've probably never heard of him. Guy thinks that he can sell a book or two, but, you know, whatever. Whatever. But we're over here at Brandon Sanderson's site here, and Sanderson's first law. The way that he puts this is well worth bringing up. You might have other names for these concepts, or maybe it's something you've always felt that is instinctual, or something you've noticed through all of your journeys through comic books or novels. But here is a way that you can think about the magic in your fantasy world. I like magic systems. That's probably evident to those of you who have read my work. A solid, interesting, and innovative system of magic in a book is something that really appeals to me. True, characters are what make a story narratively powerful, but magic is a large part of what makes the fantasy genre distinctive. For a while now, I've been working on various theories regarding magic systems. There's a lot to consider here. As a writer, I want a system that is fun to write. As a reader, I want something that is something fun to read. As a storyteller, I want a setting element that is narratively sound and which offers room for mystery and discovery. A good magic system should be both visually appealing and should work to enhance the mood of a story. It should facilitate the narrative and provide a source of conflict. I'd like to approach the concept of magic in several different essays, each detailing one of the laws I've developed to explain what I think makes good magic systems. As always, these are just my thoughts. Though I call them laws, they're nothing more than simple guidelines that have worked for me. Just like it's sometimes good to violate rules of grammar, authors can violate my theories and still have good books. However, I do think that by following these, you can work to develop more potent and memorable magic in your books. Or in this case, in your world that you want to present through a TTRPG. When I applied to be on the programming of my very first WorldCon, following my sale of Elantris, but before the book was actually released, I saw they were doing a How Does Magic Work panel. I eagerly indicated that I'd very much like to be a part of it, and to my delight, the committee put me on. A little bit of personal history, we'll forward through there. There are, in this law, there are two concepts, soft and hard magic. Soft magic. And so I began to develop my first law as a way to include magic systems that don't follow very strict rules, but which also don't undermine their plots. Let me state in my law again, and okay, the author can do that, yep. This leaves room for those who want to perceive a sense of wonder in their books. I see a continuum, or a scale, measuring how authors use their magic. On one side of the continuum, we have books where the magic is included in order to establish a sense of wonder and give the setting a fantastical feel. Books that focus on this use of magic tend to want to indicate that men are a small part of the eternal and mystical workings of the universe. This gives the reader the sense of tension. They're never certain what dangers or wonders the characters will encounter. Indeed, the characters themselves never truly know what can happen and what can't. I call this a soft magic system, and it has a long-established tradition in fantasy. I'd argue that Tolkien himself is on this side of the continuum. In his books, you rarely understand the capabilities of wizards and their ilk. You instead spend your time identifying with the hobbits, who feel they've been thrown into something much larger and more dangerous than themselves. By holding back laws and rules of magic, Tolkien makes us feel that this world is vast and that there are unimaginable powers surging and moving beyond our sight. However, there is something you have to understand about writing on this side of the continuum. The really good writers of soft magic systems very, very rarely use their magic to solve problems in their books. Magic creates problems. Then people solve those problems with their own without much magic. George R.R. Martin's A Song of Fire and Ice uses this paradigm quite effectively. There's a reason that Gandalf doesn't just fly Frodo to Mount Doom with magic, then let him drop the ring in. Narratively, that just doesn't work with the magic system. We don't know what it can do, and so if the writer uses it to solve a lot of problems, then the tension in the novel ends up feeling weak. The magic undermines the plot instead of enhancing it. So if you want to write soft magic systems, I suggest you hold yourself to not letting your magic solve problems for your characters. If the characters try to use the magic, it shouldn't do what they expect it to, as the reader doesn't know what to expect either. Use the magic for visuals and for ambiance, but not for plot. Unless it's there to screw things up for the characters, that's always okay. Hard magic. On the other side of the continuum, we have hard magic. This is the side where the authors explicitly describe the rules of magic. This is done so that the reader can have fun, the fun of feeling like they themselves are a part of the magic, and so that the author can show clever twists and turns in the way the magic works. The magic itself is a character, and by showing off its laws and rules, the author is able to provide twists, world building, and characterization. If the reader understands how the magic works, then you can use the magic, or rather the characters using the magic, to solve problems. In this case, it's not the magic mystically making everything better. Instead, the character's wit and experience that solves the problems. Magic becomes another tool, and, like any other tool, its careful application can enhance the character and the plot. I would place Isaac Asimov on this side of the continuum. It's a bit irregular of me to use a man who, from essays I've read, was generally disapproving of the fantasy genre. Asimov argued that fantasy was about dumb people, men with swords, killing smart people in the form of wizards. However, I think Isaac's robot stories are a perfect example of a hard magic system. In his robot stories, Asimov outlines 3 distinct laws, then never adds any more and never violates those laws. From the interplay of those 3 laws, he gave us dozens of excellent stories and ideas. Note that by calling something hard magic, I'm not implying that it has to follow laws of science, or even that there have to be explanations of why people can use this magic. All I'm talking about is the reader's understanding of what the magic can do. Take superheroes, for instance. You may be tempted to assume that superhero magic is a soft magic system. Remember, we talked about superhero fantasy in the last segment. After all, the powers are often ridiculous, with reasons for existing that defy any kind of logic or science. I.e., I got bit by a radioactive spider, then gained the powers of a spider. That's dumb. Who would ever... I can never in a million years imagine a premise like that leading to some popular fantasy character that might very well be the world's most popular superhero. How dumb is that? I got bit by a radioactive spider. Get out of here. 2 out of 10 wouldn't recommend. However, superhero systems are very much hard magic systems. Remember, we're looking at this as writers, not as scientists. Narratively, superhero magic tends to be rather specific and explicit, depending on the story. We generally know exactly which powers Spider-Man has and what they can do. He, 1, can sense danger, 2, has superhuman strength and endurance, 3, can shoot webs from his hands, and 4, can cling to walls. While in the comics, he does sometimes gain other strange powers, making the system softer, he does generally stick to the abilities in the movies. Therefore, we're not surprised when Spider-Man shoots a web in a bad guy's face. We've established that he can do that, and it makes sense to us when he does it. It is narratively a hard magic system, rather than a soft magic system. Then we have the middle ground. Most writers are somewhere in the middle between these two extremes. A good example of what I consider to be near the center point would be Rowling's Harry Potter books. Each of these books outlines various rules, laws, and ideas for magic of the world, and in that given book, those laws are rarely violated, and often they are important to the workings of the book's climax. However, if you look at the setting as a whole, you don't really ever understand the capabilities of magic. She adds new rules as she adds books, expanding the system, sometimes running into contradictions, and conveniently forgetting abilities the characters had in previous novels. These lapses aren't important to the story, and each single book is generally cohesive. I think she balances this rather well, actually. In specifics, her magic is hard. In the bigger picture, her magic is soft. That allows her to use magic as points of conflict resolution, yet maintain a strong sense of wonder in the novels. I consider my own magic systems to be perhaps 80% hard, maybe a bit more. My own paradigm is to develop a complicated magic system which can be explained as simply as possible, but which has a lot of background and behind-the-scenes rules. Many of these workings don't get explained in the books, particularly at the first. The characters have some good understanding of the magic, but they rarely understand its complete form. This is partially because I treat my magics like sciences, and I don't believe that we will ever completely understand all the laws of science. Partially, also, I do this so that I can have discoveries and revelations in the novels. I like mystery more than I like mysticism. So following this, we have my own Mistborn series. In them, I outline many rules of the magic, then offer up a few unexplained exceptions or inconsistencies, which I proceed to explain in further books. The interplay of how the different laws of magic works is vital to understanding major plot points. Now, you can finish this out, how to use this, other examples. This is our understanding. This is now the foundation for your custom campaign, for your custom world. If you are just running vanilla D&D out of the player's handbook, that is a hard magic system. All the spells that could possibly be are there. You know how to cast them. You know the details of casting them. The world accepts that magic exists in different forms. You know, not just different classifications or schools of magic, but sources of magic, arcane or divine, maybe primal. But it's still a known quantity. But that's why if we come up to what you do in a hard magic system, it puts you into this world, and magic is now a tool to be used. Which is why this also tends to lean into superhero fantasy, because if you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, you are the big damn hero. You start out as the son of the farmer, and then you overthrow God by the end of the campaign. So, this is why we default to hard magic in our D&D games. Or why, this was a very interesting topic that was brought up, I saw over on Twitter, X. It was Real Grey Mage had brought up something about spell components. And how many of you out there ever really track or read spell components, or you just presume that they're there because you want to cast the spells? Like, you want to just use the magic, and the magic isn't really a fantastic part of the world. Or we just say, I have an implement, and so I cast my magic through a magic wand. The wand is our throwaway of, okay, this is how magic manifests. Don't really care much beyond that. We just want the thing to work. I want to cast a spell that dimensionally sizes the room. Here's my spell. This is my magical implement in this hard magic system. I want to cast the spell Reduce Thirst. Okay. I want to cast the spell Detect Fire Range Touch. Okay. I cast my magic. I don't really care about the minutia. That's a focus that we can talk about for world building or campaign focus. We're using magic because it's a known thing. We're just using it as a tool. I have conjured this brave knight. I have conjured this brave knight who's ready to go out on some probably isekai adventure. Okay? Just boom. What if I told you that my component was nothing more than some mysterious gray liquid and magic light? And that's how I conjured this adventurer. Okay? Goblin of Gygaxanor, I absolutely agree. Either as a MacGuffin, or it actually puts more emphasis on the magic in the world. Hunter, I was at a pew shop with a kiddo, was shouting his name. A big dude was like, what? Turns out he's an Adam too. Should I buy some dumb for $10.99? What does that mean, Hunter? Can you interpret that for me? But yeah, apparently there is many Adams in one place there. So this is what you have to ask yourself. And there's nothing wrong with running vanilla D&D out of the player's handbook and you just accept that magic is there, because that's what you're signing up for. I just want to play a character that can cast spells and use them strategically as a tool. As a thief uses a crowbar to cast open window or open treasure chest, I want to cast a spell. I want to cast the knock spell to do the same thing, or the shatter spell to do the same thing. In this case, it's another tool. Now, we'll take a break. We've been talking about this for about an hour. We're setting the foundation of our conversation, and when we come back, I want to talk about then not just the considerations for the fantasy world you want to present, but not just the in-world, the in-character. Let's have a bit of a meta conversation as well about things that are considered, things that are allowed, things that aren't, and see how that can affect the presentation. Oh, at your local game store? I mean, hey, I'm always for people supporting their friendly local game store, Hunter. All right. So, quick 5 to 10 minute break. Stretch, do what you gotta do. And, Hunter, I don't know. I could check offhand if that's a card I have, if you'd prefer to do business with a real store. I mean, I may not have it. I don't know offhand, but I can ask if you'd like. Anyway, 5 to 10 minute break. When we come back, let's talk out of character and not just in character, in world, in story considerations.